Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you is not speculation, it's not hopium, and it's definitely not something you're going to hear on CNBC or Bloomberg, because something big is happening with XRP right now, and the silence from the mainstream should already be setting off alarms in your head, because when institutions go quiet, it's usually because positioning is already underway and retail is once again late to the party. So ask yourself this right now: why is Ripple suddenly being mentioned in the same breath as global settlement infrastructure? Why are conversations quietly surfacing around BlackRock, the IMF, the BIS, and cross-border liquidity frameworks? And why does the SEC suddenly look like it's backing into a corner it created itself? Because this changes everything, and if you've been sleeping on XRP thinking the story is over, prepare for shock, because the chessboard has shifted while most people were still arguing about checkers. And before we go any further, if you want real-time breakdowns like this that cut through the noise, smash the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications right now, because what we're uncovering here is unfolding fast, and you do not want to miss the next move, especially when legacy finance, central banks, and crypto-native power players are quietly aligning behind infrastructure that was built years ago for this exact moment. And here's the part that should make you say WTF out loud. XRP is no longer being discussed as a speculative asset in the rooms that matter. It's being discussed as a utility, a bridge, a liquidity tool in a world where dollars, euros, and yen are starting to move differently. And the timing of all of this lining up right as regulatory pressure eases and macro stress spikes is not coincidence. It's coordination. And if you're still thinking this is just another YouTube headline, you're already behind, because the initial setup is happening now and the signal is in what they're not telling you. Now, let's ground this urgency in cold, uncomfortable reality, because this is where the data and authority collide in a way that makes people nervous. And when people get nervous, that's usually where opportunity hides. Because while social media is distracted by memes and short-term price candles, the real story is buried in regulatory language, institutional filings, and infrastructure moves that almost nobody reads. Yet right now, those documents are screaming because Ripple has quietly expanded partnerships across Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, at the exact same time the IMF is openly talking about interoperability between digital assets and legacy payment rails. And ask yourself why the Bank for International Settlements keeps publishing papers about tokenized liquidity corridors, while Ripple executives are suddenly showing up at closed-door financial summits alongside central bankers and policy architects, because this is not random networking, this is systems design. And if you think BlackRock doesn't understand this, you're underestimating the most powerful asset manager on the planet, because BlackRock doesn't chase narratives, they position before narratives exist, and the same goes for JP Morgan, Citi, and even the Fed-aligned research arms that are suddenly warming up to blockchain-based settlement layers. And here's the kicker that almost nobody wants to talk about. The SEC case, the very thing that was supposed to kill XRP, ended up drawing a legal line in the sand that most other crypto assets still don't have, and that clarity is oxygen for institutions, because they do not move without regulatory breathing room. And suddenly, XRP has something very few assets have: a framework, a precedent, and a path forward. And while critics scream manipulation or favoritism, the reality is far more uncomfortable. XRP survived the regulatory gauntlet while others are still waiting in line. And that survival didn't happen by accident. It happened because Ripple spent years building relationships, infrastructure, and credibility while everyone else chased hype cycles. And if you still think this is just a retail-driven story, ask yourself why on-demand liquidity volumes keep expanding quietly, why Ripple keeps hiring policy experts instead of influencers, and why global payment corridors are being stress-tested during one of the most fragile macro environments in decades, because when the system starts to wobble, the pipes matter more than the paint, and XRP sits directly inside the pipes. Now here's where the catalyst enters and where the fear, uncertainty, and doubt crowd completely loses control of the narrative, because every single time XRP starts creeping back into serious conversations, the same recycled attacks come out: centralized, banker coin, dead project. But let me ask you something extreme. If XRP was truly irrelevant, why does it still live rent-free in the minds of its loudest critics after a decade? And why does coordinated negativity spike right before major macro or regulatory inflection points? Because that pattern alone should tell you this isn't organic skepticism, it's narrative warfare. And the real catalyst brewing right now is not one headline. It's convergence, it's regulatory thaw, institutional readiness, and global financial stress all colliding at once because the world is drowning in debt, settlement times are too slow, liquidity is fragmented, and central banks are panicking behind closed doors while publicly pretending everything is fine. And into that chaos steps a pre-built, battle-tested system designed to move value instantly across borders without pre-funded accounts, and that scares the hell out of legacy intermediaries who make billions skimming time and friction. So of course the FUD machine spins up. Of course influencers suddenly rediscover decade-old talking points. But here's the uncomfortable truth. None of that stops infrastructure once it's needed. Nobody cared about TCP/IP until the internet needed it. Nobody cared about SWIFT until global trade demanded it. And nobody will care about Twitter arguments when banks and institutions need real-time liquidity rails that actually work under stress. And the catalyst you're missing is that the stress is here. Geopolitical fragmentation, currency weaponization, sanctions, trade realignments, all of this creates demand for neutral settlement layers. And XRP sits right at the intersection of speed, liquidity, and regulatory survivability. So when you hear people screaming that Ripple partnerships don't matter or that adoption is fake, understand that real adoption is boring, it's quiet, and it happens long before price reacts, and by the time CNBC tells you it's real, the move is already gone. This is where things get uncomfortable for people who only think in short-term charts, because price justification is not about tomorrow's candle. It's about scale, and once you understand the scale XRP is positioned for, your entire framework breaks, because ask yourself this brutal question: what is the price of an asset designed to facilitate trillions in cross-border value flow when liquidity fragmentation is no longer acceptable? Because people throw out numbers like $10, $50, $100 without ever asking what happens when even a fraction of global settlement volume touches a finite asset with real utility. And this is where the final warning comes in, because markets do not move when retail feels comfortable. They move when disbelief peaks, and right now disbelief around XRP is still widespread, which is exactly what you would expect before a structural repricing, because if XRP were already obviously valuable, institutions wouldn't have the time or space to accumulate positions. And here's the part. Nobody wants to say out loud, price suppression narratives aside, utility assets do not explode overnight. They reprice violently when a threshold is crossed, when usage forces repricing, and that threshold is always invisible until it's already behind you. And with Ripple positioned in regulatory dialogue, liquidity corridors expanding, and global finance inching toward tokenization, whether people like it or not, the risk is not holding XRP. The risk is assuming the world will go back to the old system. Because once settlement speed becomes a necessity instead of a luxury, valuation models based on memes and vibes die instantly. And the final warning is simple and brutal. If you wait for perfect clarity, you will pay a premium, because clarity is what institutions sell to latecomers, not what they wait for themselves. And here's how this all comes together, because at the end of the day, this isn't about tribal loyalty to a token, it's about pattern recognition, and the pattern is unmistakable to anyone willing to zoom out and ignore the noise. XRP has survived regulatory fire, outlasted multiple hype cycles, and quietly embedded itself into conversations and corridors that most retail investors will never see until after the fact. And the reason this moment feels tense, confusing, and controversial is because those are always the conditions right before a major narrative flips. When disbelief is high, coverage is minimal, and confidence is fractured, because that's when positioning happens, not celebration. And if you take anything away from this video, let it be this: markets reward preparation, not reaction. And whether XRP becomes the backbone of a restructured global settlement layer, or simply a key component within it, the direction of travel is clear: faster, more efficient, more interoperable finance is not optional anymore, it's inevitable, and assets that already live in that future do not need permission from Twitter or validation from headlines to matter. They just need time and pressure, both of which are now accelerating. So stay sharp, question narratives, and remember, by the time everyone agrees something big is happening, the biggest part of the move is usually already history.